Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Talkin Soccer. I am your host, Justin Hornkert. It's been a minute, but thank you for coming back. It's a good time to have this podcast. Some big news happening in the world of women's soccer announced last week that deserves a little bit deeper of a dive. I've been writing about the Trinity Rodman contract situation over on the Talkin Soccer newsletter, but I wanted to take a moment here in audio form and video form just to elaborate a little bit more, give some more of my thoughts, and just talk about the wider implications on free agency in general. Centering this conversation around the idea that NWSL is competing in a global market in a way that the leagues that it's trying to emulate itself after, NWSL always talks about, Jessica Berman specifically always talks about, it's going to be the NFL of women's sports. There's a problem with that comparison, that I think there's an arrogance that isn't quite considering all possible angles of where the NWSL is in the current women's sports space and in the current soccer space. And I wanted to kind of take this opportunity to talk about some of the implications of Trinity Rodman's contract situation, of this rumored high impact player rule, and how that affects, say, Sophia Wilson's contract. So, folks, let's get into it. Thank you again so much for stopping by. I wrote about it already on the newsletter, but last Thursday night really, late into the day, Jeff Kassouf of ESPN broke a pretty important piece of news that as the Trinity Rodman contract situation seemed to be at a standstill. We're coming into the NWSL Championship. It's seeming like it isn't really going anywhere. Trinity Rodman clearly wants to stay in DC. DC clearly want to re-sign Trinity Rodman, but there's this tricky little thing of the salary cap that's getting in the way. Washington Spirit, of course, have been moving. Michelle Kang, is no stranger to spending this amount of money, wants to be able to spend more money on her team, but the cap being the way it is has been a limiting factor for the league over the past couple of years. When you look at Naomi McGurmill leaving, when you look at Alyssa Thompson leaving, you look at players getting paid a lot more money than they were in the NWSL to go over to Europe, and specifically the Women's Super League that is trying to unseat the NWSL from its delicate perch atop the women's soccer world. I think if you ask people on either side of the pond, they'll have different answers of if the NWSL is the best league in the world. People are tired of this conversation. I'm not here to have that conversation specifically, but what I am here to say, here to center this conversation around, is as the NWSL is talking out of both sides of its mouth, as Jessica Berman does her media blitz during championship week, talking about how the NWSL is the best league in the world, wants to be the best league in the world, it's going to make decisions that continue being the best league in the world. It's also making decisions that, one, talking about parity and how one player isn't bigger than the league. That's how your star players leave, because you're not willing to amend your rule set to allow your players, your high caliber players, your U.S. women's national team stars stay domestically in the league. Because some players will always want to leave for Europe, of course. You want a new challenge. You want to experience a different style of play, maybe, or even a different lifestyle. But there have been players that want to stay in America. If you look at players that left after college, that if you look at the Mia Fishel situation of, this is part of why the NWSLPA wanted to abolish the draft in the first place, that Mia Fishel looked at the environment, saw that she can go down to Mexico, that she could get playing time right away to begin with, and that she would have a better contract situation going to Mexico and going that route versus being drafted by the NWSL and signing that initial contract. So we get rid of the draft, but there's still some barriers of entry and still some barriers to players making the money that they are due, making their complete market value. Women's soccer players are still underpaid compared to what they give market-wise, with their marketability factor compared to the men's game. If you think of what we're talking about here, Trinity Rodman's contract, a middling player in Major League Soccer is making more or as much as the star players in the NWSL just based on their salaries in general. Obviously, a player like Trinity Rodman is making more from endorsements than just pick a player from your MLS club. And I'm saying that because MLS players don't make as much as the top players in Europe, as the top leagues in Europe, I should say. So there are levels to this. And when you're talking about this sum of money that isn't a lot in the grand scheme of things, especially when you have a league that's raking in $200 million in expansion fees recently with Atlanta coming in. And you have owners committing, Arthur Blank commits $200 million to expansion, an extra $150 million to facilities. These are owners that are not afraid to spend money elsewhere. But when it comes to the quality on the field, as the league is bragging about record ratings, record merchandise, record revenue, now all of a sudden it needs to keep salaries intact. It can't explode in paying salaries. But we're talking about an increase of the base salary cap by 2029 within the CBA is going to rise to $5.1 million. That's the base. With where revenue is going, the revenue share, things get added onto that cap. So there's a realistic expectation that cap could rise to around $7 million by the time that last year the CBA comes in. What I think the PA needs to be asking for, and maybe this is a next CBA conversation, but the NWSLPA needs to look at that. They need to take stock of where we are in the world, see that Women's Super League clubs are starting to put more money into their teams. You look at Michelle King buying London City, investing in OLENS, and willing to invest money in those spaces as well. The amount of clubs that are coming into that global market is increasing every year. The NWSL is looking around, and they're not seeing that. They're just seeing themselves as a single entity, as the end-all be-all of where players want to play. This is not, obviously not every person in the league thinks this way. A lot of GMs don't. If you look at that anonymous GM survey from last month, or from a couple months back that, again, Jeff Kassouf posted on ESPN, a lot of GMs would rather it be an open system. Of course, GMs want their job to be easier. They want to be able to bring in players. But when you're in a global market where there are restrictions on who you can sign, when you can sign them, how they fit within your structure, and you're competing against a league in the Women's Super League and any Champions League team in general, they don't have those restrictions. Of course, they have financial fair play, but as we see on the men's side all the time, you can game around financial fair play, and it's a little bit looser. You know, it's a very, very soft cap as opposed to what teams in the NWSL are dealing with. And when a Chelsea can come in and offer the money that they do to Alyssa Thompson to the point where Alyssa Thompson says, I got to go. I got to take this deal. I want to go to Europe. This money is too good to pass up. You have to sell me now. Not only is it, kneecapping themselves into keeping their best players, but they're also sacrificing transfer fees because a team can come in, offer a salary that players have to take just for the sake of their own professional future. And then now this player wants to leave. If this player stays, they're not going to be happy here because you blocked this move that's going to give them generational wealth. And you have to accept less money from a transfer fee. There's a lot of, that isn't every scenario, not every situation, but there's a lot of different factors that come into this that you can't look at the NWSL and say, we want to be like the NFL. We have to structure things like the NFL or like the NBA and these leagues that we want to emulate. But the NFL isn't competing with a comparable European league that not only can they offer more money, because the NFL, of course, there have been in spring football leagues, people want to try to compete. It never works because those leagues can't offer the money that an NFL contract does, or at least consistently and sustainably to bring star players into the league. When you look at the top Euro leagues, they have this financial background. A lot of them are richer than NWSL clubs are going to be able to be. Not richer owners. There are some very rich owners in this league, but they're able to make plays. If you look at Olympique Lyonnais' roster, if you look at Chelsea, if you look at Arsenal, their complete wage bill is going to dwarf an NWSL team just based on how the salary cap is structured. So those teams can go out, spend just a minuscule fraction of what they spend on their men's teams and get huge results, huge interest on them. If you think of Chelsea and where they are in the women's game, they spend a lot in women's soccer, but compared to what they spend on the men's side and what men's teams spend in general, it's not much. And now you're getting to the point where attendances are starting to catch up to that. Revenue in general is starting to catch up to that. And now it's these teams are starting to catch up to you. And as the NWSL, you had such a big advantage that you kind of squandered. So let's talk about the Trinity Rodman rule, or the high impact player rule as it states. So as we're kind of marching up to that cliff of the National Champions League, of the NWSL Championship, My mouth is tongue-tied with all this Champions League talk. As you're walking up to the cliff of the NWSL Championship, it's pretty much thought that this isn't going to happen. Trinity Rodman is talking like she wants to stay, talking like they'll try to do something, but everything that Jessica Berman is saying, everything that the league is kind of putting out there, makes you think that this deal, whatever, isn't going to happen. So the Spirit offer a contract that is completely legal within the CBA. They figure out how to get this done. It's backloaded. It's going to hinder the Spirit going forward if they agree to this, because it is backloaded in the way that it is. And Jessica Berman and the NWSL League office vetoed the deal. You can't do this. Berman says it violates the spirit of the rules. And, if you're looking at it, it probably is a bad contract. It probably is a bad idea to tie up so much of your salary cap into one star player, especially when you, as a Spirit, have so many players that you need to kind of balance with the cap. But it shouldn't be the league commissioner's job to stop teams from signing deals that are going to handcuff them in the future. If you look at the leagues that they are trying to emulate, if you look at the NFL, if you look at, I think of the NHL salary cap all the time, just because I am a hockey fan, and the salary cap is so interesting in that league, and that there aren't any restrictions outside of the cap, right? You don't have these mechanisms of where a contract has to fall outside of a max and a min. And I think of how a player like Connor McDavid takes less money because he knows that if he takes his full value, that really hinders what the team can do in terms of filling in around him. Now, this is complete player wage suppression. Connor McDavid is making half of what he should be making as a player as far as his impact. But this is not a hockey podcast. But it gives you an idea of what the NWSL is thinking, where they think of themselves, where they think of how this cap is working. The problem there, again, is that NHL is not competing with European leagues in terms of signing players. And if you think of where the KHL was before the sanctions, KHL could compete with Russian players, and there are plenty of players who didn't leave for the NHL because they are comfortable in Russia in their domestic league. But now, and with where hockey is in general, the NHL isn't worried about European teams coming in, offering huge money deals to players, and having to deal with that. That doesn't influence them at all. They are the big game in town, and they know that they are only competing with themselves. They don't have to compete with other leagues, and they're only select players that want to go home, or, your fourth liners that want to go elsewhere to get more playing time, that sort of thing. That is not where the NWSL is. Trinity Rodman, while she was giving she's given offers by DC Power that are completely nonsensical, would also had interest from Michelle King's other club. I'm sure would love to sign her, London City, but Chelsea, Arsenal, think of Olympique Lyonnais, these top-end Champions clubs as well. There are teams that would be able to come in if Trinity Rodman can't get a deal under the cap that would happily sign her, and probably sign her to a bigger deal than what she would make in DC. So they work out this deal. Rodman and her camp are ready to sign it. Spirit are ready to accept it. Spirit are ready to offer and sign. The commissioner vetoes it. NWSLPA, Megan Burke, goes on Women's Game podcast, goes on a bit of a media blitz, talks about where the NWSLPA stands on it. In her eyes, this was a completely legal contract. Berman says it violates the spirit of the rules. Anonymous sources told reporters that they saw it and it wasn't legal. But NWSLPA says it was completely legal. They file a grievance against the NWSL. And that was kind of where we were. We were kind of stuck, waiting for arbitration to happen, waiting for some sort of ruling to come down. Before I go forward, that grievance is still ongoing, because what the NWSL is arguing is that the league is violating the rights of free agency that they negotiated in the CBA, that a player is able to move freely, to sign a contract freely. Those are the terms of the CBA. This interpretation from Berman that things can violate the spirit of the rules, that's not what's on paper, and it's the NWSLPA's job to enforce the things that are on paper of that collective bargaining agreement. So we still have some ways to go. That's going to go to arbitration. I think the NWSL had 14 days from last week to get to the bottom of that. So another week of waiting on that front. But what we do have is on Thursday night, Jeff Kassouf of ESPN reported that a high impact player rule was being discussed and being worked on, What this rule would be, and the report now is that this will be voted on at the Board of Governors meeting and that there are enough votes to push this through. And I think it sounds like there are still some owners who aren't on board, which is a real problem in my mind. But for the owners that want to invest, what this does is it gives clubs an ability to sign one player, a high impact player that meets certain sporting and marketing merits, which is interesting. We'll get to that at the end, to a contract that is above the salary cap and that would only count towards 12% of your cap and has to be over that 12% mark. This is what Kasuf is reporting. We don't know what the final ideas of this rule will be. We don't know the ins and outs of this mechanism. So it could be completely different by the time this gets voted on and approved. But as far as what Kasuf has reported and what others have reported at this point, it would allow teams to spend up to $1 million over the cap on top-end players while incurring only a 12% portion of that salary cap hit. So what that would allow the Spirit to do in this instance specifically is to go offer Trinity Rodman the money that she deserves and not completely ruin their salary cap. So essentially MLS's designated player rule with some extra steps and not hard and fast a designated player rule. Some things will change, and especially as that salary cap escalates, and if it does escalate closer to that 10 million mark, some of those players that signed a high impact player would not necessarily be that as the cap increases. So something to consider as these things are always changing. But it would allow Trinity Rodman to stay. It would allow the NWSL a little bit extra firepower into keeping those highly marketable players, their star players, in the league. And that is such an important thing for this league, especially after losing Naomi Girma, losing Alyssa Thompson, young players that Naomi Girma should have been the face of the NWSL for the next decade. Now, some of that is the factor of everything that's gone on in San Diego the past 2 years and just the poisoning of that front office and just the environment that she was in last season. So maybe nothing would have stopped Naomi Girma from leaving, but this does give clubs an opportunity to keep those players in-house, but also it allows clubs from elsewhere to keep these high-end players in the league. It's good in general to allow clubs to be able to spend like this, as I've been arguing this entire video. So the interesting part of this is that in kind of the fine print, sources said, this is from Jeff Kasuf, sources said that a high-impact player must meet some requirements from a list of both sporting and commercial benchmarks to be eligible for the funds. Sporting benchmarks discussed in board deliberations included rankings on lists like the Ballon d'Or, appearances in the NWSL Best 11, or USWNT minutes earned in recent years. So that gives you an idea of the type of players that would be eligible. I think it's interesting that a player would have to be eligible to be signed to this deal. So essentially, the NWSL is saying you can't go out and sign an unproven player to this huge deal, even if you know that they're going to come into the league and be a hit. So say when the Current signed Thelma Chwinga, which was the steal of the century when you look at it, they wouldn't be able to bring her in, or when Orlando go and get Barbara Banda, they wouldn't be able to bring them in as high-impact players, probably, because they probably wouldn't hit these marketing and sporting merit numbers that are being discussed. So it is interesting in that concept that there will be certain players that might not even be eligible to sign these big deals. But with what the intent of this is, which is to keep U.S. women's national team players in the league, which has always been the goal of the league back to when U.S. soccer was paying U.S. women's national team players instead of clubs. It's always been the goal to give U.S. women's national team players not just a high-quality league to play in, but also to keep them in the U.S. and keep them close to the domestic fan base. That is inescapable. That is the goal of the NWSL. It should always have the top USWNT players in it. But when Jessica Berman is out here talking about how the league has to be bigger than any one player, it's interesting then that this is the mechanism that we get to. So this will handcuff, like, say Rodman and Spirit do sign on the dotted line, this rule gets voted through. It does a little bit handcuff the Spirit, because now everyone knows that they can't go out and get a high-impact player. They have their high-impact player on the roster that, barring some other changes in the salary cap, barring some mechanisms that take her under the threshold, we don't even know yet. But it at least gives the NWSL some firepower in the international market. Obviously, there are only 16 spots, 15 if Rodman signs. where teams can go out and go into the international market, sign your Alexis Patelis of the world. Your Katerina Macario, someone please save her from Sonia Bonpastor. I'm begging you. It gives the teams a little bit of extra firepower, the teams that want to spend. Now, not every team will want to go out and get a high impact player. That's kind of been the thing dragging the league down. Is some of these ownership groups aren't ambitious at all. They just want to park their investment, park their women's soccer team, say, get all the praise for owning a women's soccer team, get all the praise for owning a sports franchise, but they don't want to actually invest and forward the sport and do what's best for the league in general. But it is in general, this is a good step forward. It just cannot be the only thing the league does. There has to be some other ancillary moves, maybe not this offseason, maybe next offseason, maybe you wait for this rule to go be implemented, see what happens from here on out, and then go back to the drawing board. In my mind, this could have all been solved by just simply raising the salary cap. But it seems like owners want some insurance that they don't have to commit to spending that much, which in general, like, there's a floor, there's a ceiling. You can spend to the floor. You don't have to spend to the salary cap ceiling. But I think there's probably owners don't want to be seen as cheap and not willing to spend the extra $3 million on the salary cap. And I say that too, because NWSL revenues are growing exponentially from where they've been 5 years ago. And you're talking about salary numbers that a lot of these, it's different than it used to be. It's not the same to where a lot of these owners also own the city's MLS club, but there are still some of those, and there are multi-club ownership groups as well. But you look at, say, like in Kansas City, what Chris and Angie Long spent on CPKC, on the facilities, on just everything around the club. You look at what Michelle Kang, and if you even look at what Angel City spent on their facilities, all of this money going into the league, but none of it seems to go to the players as they are boasting the record revenue that comes from the players. If you don't have the players, you don't have the revenue. Anyway, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole today. But if you are, looking at the next steps of how this won't be enough or how this will be enough, you can look at the Sophia Wilson situation that now, is the next big free agency bowling pin out there. Nothing has really kind of been said about Sophia Wilson's status. Portland, right now, where they stand, they lost to DC, to the Spirit in the second round. Rob Gale was fired. If you talk to Portland fans, they would not be surprised about that, even though they make the second round. There's a lot of frustration with how Rob Gale managed. And yeah, you can definitely see it in his game management. But a lot of development with Portland the last 2 years, that they're in a good spot. If you add Sophia Wilson to the mix, all of a sudden they're maybe one of the favorites next season. But Sophia Wilson, missing 2025 on maternity leave, has a player option. And this would be a good spot for this high-impact player rule. Portland can go out. They can sign Sophia Wilson. They don't have to worry about the contract. They don't have to worry about European clubs coming in and offering deals that will potentially unsettle her. She probably doesn't want to move after just having a kid. I think that those other dynamics have to be considered as well. But then there's also the elephant in the room, which is the Denver Summit coming in and potentially being able to offer her that deal as well. But what it does do is it allows, if there was a bidding war to take place for Sophia Wilson, if this Rodman rule, this high impact player rule were to go in place, NWSL clubs wouldn't necessarily have to worry about what that would mean to the rest of their ability. GMs wouldn't have to worry that if we give Sophia Wilson everything she's demanding, that it's going to hurt them down the line as they're trying to fill out their squad and trying to navigate the salary cap. And that is good. To make GM jobs easier, I guess, is what I'm advocating for here. But to be able to allow some of that flexibility, to add more mechanisms, just to keep a player like Sophia Wilson in the league. Because as we talk about Trinity Rodman and just kind of being this generation's face of the league, Sophia Wilson is also right there as well. And a proven winner, proven goal scorer, proven player that can create things on their own. I would even argue that if Sophia Wilson returns to where she was prior to maternity leave, that is a player that's more important to keep around than Trinity Rodman. So how these next steps play out are going to be very, very important and very worth paying attention to. Now, it could just turn out that, like Midge Purse, Sophia Wilson just returns to Portland. But it is interesting that they make that coaching change. I think that is maybe maybe a sign that they want to manage how to make this the best landing spot for Sophia Wilson. Not to read between the lines. I think there are a lot of things that went into that, and especially with where the league was this year, just landing in a home playoff spot doesn't necessarily mean that the team competed and met expectations, even though I would argue that they exceeded expectations. We'll talk about this as we get into the offseason, but the Rob Gale thing is interesting because I think he did a very good job of developing players in Portland, but there was like obvious from the start of his tenure, and I think that some of that bad will from how that start went just kind of followed him throughout the rest of his 2 seasons in Portland. But that is a story for a different time, and we'll see if he lands somewhere else. But taking a look at the free agency market right now, it is interesting because a lot of the big names have just kind of re-signed, taking a lot of the fun out of it. If you look at, Midge Purse resigning, I already talked about that, but maybe it's just that there weren't a ton of big name free agents this year in general, but Listener returning to Chicago. Let's talk about the names that are out there now. I think the big one to me, obviously we talked about Trinity Rodman, we talked about Sophia Wilson. What's happened already, Haley Mace going from KC to Orlando. That's kind of the shock of the free agency season so far. A player that I think works very well in Orlando's system and fits a really precise need and is moving to be closer to her partner. That's a good move for everyone outside of KC. And KC too, I think would have had some difficult decisions navigating the cap, and Haley Mace leaving maybe saves some of that, as much as I'm sure that they would rather have her in the lineup. Their big bowling pin for this offseason is Bia Zanerato. As a free agent, no discussions have kind of advanced yet as far as her returning. And I think just kind of reading the tea leaves, it seems like she probably goes back home to Brazil. She's at that point in their career. She's had her NWSL stint that maybe now you return home, just be closer to your family. But I don't see her signing anywhere else in the NWSL if it isn't in KC. That's an interesting one to follow just in case that does happen. But outside of that, there aren't a ton of big names left on the market. I think there are some unsung names like Kiki Pickett, Bay FC. She's a free agent. That's a name that I would be very interested if I was saying Chicago or Houston and really any team outside of the top 4, even Portland, and bringing in. I think that's a very good player that can play either as a fullback or a defensive midfielder, even though I like her more as a fullback. If you look at Louisville have a lot of interesting decisions. Sporting director came in mid-season or at the start of last season, made some really great free agent collegiate signings. And then you look at their free agency list, there's a lot of potential for turnover of a team that you have Bev Yanes winning Coach of the Year. You have the real jump that Emma Sears took this year. You have a team that performed very well after Savannah DeMello had her medical emergency. So it's a team that has a lot of pieces there. You have Ari Borges is free agent. She's probably leaving. Bethany Balser probably leaving. So some real opportunities there to turn over some of the names that Bethany Balser you don't necessarily associate with Louisville, but some big contracts, I'm trying to say. Some real opportunity to move on there with a team that maybe overperformed expectation, but I wrote about them before the start of the year that this was kind of their put up or shut up year, that they were reaching critical mass. This is the year that they went all in on the playoff push last year. Maybe people aren't expecting that, but you have a lot of young players who are getting to that point where they have to take that step forward. And they did take that step forward, and they made some good college free agent signings last year where you would then look at them in year 2 and year 3 and expect them to take that step forward. So Louisville having some salary cap room to play with as they move on from potentially 8 players this offseason, that's an interesting one to follow too. So then you look at the next team, North Carolina. You see that they have Casey Murphy potentially leaving, Tyler Lucy leaving. There's some big minutes that they really have to manage here. They have to bring in a center back. They have to figure out their coaching situation, which is maybe figured out, but some big moves potentially to make there. Figure out how you want to play, figure out what formation, what tendencies you're looking for, and then maybe go back to the drawing board. Obviously, you kind of attempted to start over last year with the Jaden Shaw trade, just kind of cutting ties on that experiment. But there are still some very good players there on a team that missed the playoffs that should expect to make the playoffs. I mean, Manaka winning midfielder of the year, that's one of the best players in the NWSL last year. You have some very, very good pieces in that lineup that just haven't really gelled in the way that they need to. They need a complete refresh in the managerial room, which they're getting. So that's an interesting team. They have some room to make some moves this offseason as well. So still some big dominoes to fall this free agency period. But the big one, of course, is Sophia Wilson. And if we look at this high impact player rule, if this goes into effect, now all of a sudden everyone's looking at Sophia Wilson. Where does she land in this offseason? That's potentially a real championship deciding move for a team to make. Outside Denver, obviously that team, even if they sign Sophia Wilson, I don't think competes. Maybe they sneak into the playoffs. And maybe I'm wrong, because you look at Chicago with Mal Swanson, Chicago without Mal Swanson, maybe Sophia Wilson is that same level of impact. But to me, that's a player that can turn just about any team in the league into a playoff team. That's one to look for. And I think will be a big player in, if Portland lose Sophia Wilson, now they have to go out and make another big ploy. And I think that they would also be a big player in the market. So anyway, thank you all for listening to my ramblings on the high impact player mechanism that is rumored to be coming to the National Women's Soccer League. If you like what I have to say, if you like my work, thank you so much. If you aren't subscribed at Talkin Soccer, please subscribe either in your podcast feed, on the YouTube page. If you don't read my newsletter, please do. I wrote a little more in depth into the actual mechanisms of things that have been rumored and just my general thoughts. But I usually write first and then come back and do some larger pieces. So you can subscribe to my newsletter. It's linked in the bio of this podcast, of this YouTube video. And as always, folks, thank you so much. I'm hoping to be more on time, more routine with some videos here as I get our life together. But in the meantime, thank you all so much, and we will talk very soon.